David Johnston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow my honourable friend, the member for North East Bedfordshire, who always brings a lot of expertise to the debates about business matters in this House. I welcome this bill today, and I say that as a supporter of open trade and investment, not a supporter of protectionism, not least because I want to see companies and products from the UK in every country in the world. But the government's number one job is our national security. Any government's number one job is our national security. And the regime for assessing that through an investment lens was designed in 2002. Now, we can all pick something from 2002 that indicates just how long ago that was. I've opted to pick it was in 2002 that President George W. Bush declared the axis of evil of Iran, Iraq and North Korea. Now, whether you think he was right to do that or not, whether you think those were the right countries or not, the point is just to illustrate how much geopolitics has changed in that time, and that the threats we now face we were not thinking about, at least in the same way, in 2002. And so I think it's right that the government updates the regime that we use to assess these matters now. I think it's right to have a system of mandatory notifications in the 17 areas that have been defined. I mean, again, in 2002, we didn't even understand how artificial intelligence or advanced robotics might improve our lives, never mind the ways in which they might be used by hostile states to endanger our national security. I also think it's right that we have a 5-year, or the Secretary of State will have a 5-year period in which to call in trigger events after they've happened. I think that will enable him or her to perceive a threat that maybe wasn't immediately obvious at the time of the trigger event. And the government rightly says this bill is not about one country or one threat, and I think that's absolutely right. And just as we shouldn't be looking through the lens of 2002 for the current regime, we shouldn't make legislation now based on which countries we think are the threats in 2020. But I was one of the people concerned about the position we'd got into with Huawei, and I think that is in many ways, a very good example of why you need that retrospective power. Difficult though it may be to unwind some of those decisions, I think there are times when you have to do so. I also think it's right, by the way, that there's no turnover threshold to this, because if it relates to national security, it relates to national security, and turnover just simply shouldn't be a factor for this. Now, unusually, in looking at some of the criticisms of the bill before this debate, and actually I think a number of members have made great contributions about some ways we might further strengthen it, but in looking at the criticisms before, I found that actually a lot of the criticisms were things that I thought were actually in its favour. So the fact that we might have, by the government's estimate, between 1,000 and 1,830 notifications made, doesn't say to me that this new regime is too strong, but that our old regime has not been strong enough. And maybe it ends up at that number, maybe it doesn't, but it does suggest that having only had 12 assessments done in the period since 2002, that does suggest to me that we are not dealing with a strong enough set of tools to assess these situations. I also think that, again, on this point, the fact that 100 might have to go through a full national security assessment, that we might seek to impose remedies on 50 of those, again by the government's assessments, that just underlines to me why this is important and why we need a much stronger regime. I think it's right, personally, that national security isn't defined in this legislation, because I think that will enable the government, but also, importantly, our security services to interpret that in as broad a way as they can, and again, to perceive threats that they may not have perceived before. And I also think it's right that the Secretary of State makes these decisions. I've seen some poo-pooing of the role of politicians in this, the idea that they might use it for political gain or for domestic considerations which are not really about national security. But I think we elect politicians to make these judgments about national security. They're the ones that are truly accountable rather than officials. And I think it's right that that should sit with the Secretary of State. The other thing I welcome is the way in which we've borrowed from international examples. Mandatory notifications like the US and Japan have, a retrospective period like France and Germany has. This suggests to me that we've looked at the examples around the world, borrowed from all of them in order to try and have the best system for us. It does also, of course, underline that we are behind a number of our partners at the moment, both Five Eyes and our Western European partners, and to me underlines the importance of passing this quickly. So whilst I will continue to welcome foreign investment and foreign trade, I will never do so with any risk to national security. And given the actions we see from hostile states on a weekly basis through their investment decisions, I think the passage of this bill can't come quickly enough.